Back home, Indigenous leaders have welcomed the federal government's formal recognition of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Australian of the Year Mick Dodson says it's another step towards closing the gap, but critics are calling it tokenistic and are accusing the government of hypocrisy.
Parliament House was once again the setting for a symbolic gesture to Indigenous Australians.
Today, Australia takes another important step to make sure that the flawed policies of the past will never be revisited.
Following on from last year's apology to the stolen generations, the government officially endorsed the UN Declaration, which outlines the rights of the world's estimated 370 million Indigenous people. 2 years ago, the Howard government joined the United States, New Zealand and Canada in voting against it, arguing that customary laws would be elevated above Australian laws.
Today, Australia changes its position.
Australian of the Year Mick Dodson calls it another important piece of the jigsaw that is closing the gap and healing the relationship. But the declaration is not legally binding, and he'd like to see the principles enacted in law.
The value of human rights is not in their existence, it's in their implementation. That is the challenge for the world with this declaration.
New Zealand Prime Minister John Key says his government will take some time to digest the move from the New Zealand perspective and consider following suit. The Rudd government is making good on an election promise with today's ceremony. The opposition calls the move a grave error, and the coalition could reverse it if re-elected. Critics say the gesture is tokenistic and hypocritical.
It's very frustrating when, still in the Northern Territory there's a suspension of the Racial Discrimination Act.
Tom Kalma agrees that the Northern Territory intervention is racist, and although the declaration won't change Australian law, he believes governments will think twice about similar legislation in future.
That sort of practice wouldn't happen in the future. That sort of policy or legislation wouldn't happen because politicians would have to go through the discipline of testing it against human rights obligations.
The government has promised to reinstate the Racial Discrimination Act in the Northern Territory this year. Kathy Novak, World News Australia.